Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Somewhere in the deep forest of Manchuria was a quiet neighborhood. Surrounded by tall trees, the small colony was well hidden by a massive wall barbed with high voltage fence. It was unclear to the neighbors whether this was keeping someone in or keeping everyone out. But they knew one thing for sure. The only way to get into this district, or headquarters if we're being honest here, was through a single tunnel. It housed about 150 buildings, including an animal farm and an airfield. This was Pingfang District's most covert laboratory. Experiments would be conducted at all hours of the day during 3 researches, since this was the Kwantong Army's Epidemic Prevention Department. The lab itself was divided by 8 subunits, with the first division focusing on the bubonic plague, chloria, anthrax, typhoid, and tuberculosis. The lab would dissect each bacteria to decipher the disease and how they worked. If they understood it well, their research could change thousands of lives, if not millions. The second division was a little more focused. Their lab would forage material to transport the diseases, with the third division being the one that created those form of transports. The 5th to 8th division would supply the rest of the units with results of the experiments that they would conduct. Their test subjects weren't just any ordinary plants or animals, not like that's okay to test on either, but instead were prisoners of the war, or simply put, human beings. I'm sorry, let's rewind. The Kwantong Army Epidemic Prevention Department is not just an ordinary lab. It's a front to one of Japan's most deadliest weaponry unit known to date. Their goal was to spread mass productions of bacteria through biological weapons, something that could easily wipe out an entire village by a small but lethal amount of gas spread through the air. And the only way to achieve this was to test the experiments out on living beings, which we know today as Unit 731. Hi friends, welcome to Sunday Sips with Safa. I was feeling a bit lazy today, so I got myself a passion fruit iced tea with 30% sugar, and I don't think I'm going to pronounce it right. Ayu jelly. I also realized that I made hawache a few weeks ago, and I pronounced it wrong in the entire video, and I apologize for that, but that was so dumb of me, I'm so sorry. I do like this company's matcha strawberry. I don't know, they call it boba, but it's not, there's no boba in it. Plus you have to pay extra for boba now. It's I don't know. Anyways, I'm getting far ahead of myself. This is what we're drinking today. Another tea. I know, no more teas, but we keep doing teas. I'll figure it out. I promise I'll change it up. Today we're discussing the final part of the Japanese imperialism horrific act during the World Wars. Just like the last 2 episodes, the crimes that I will discuss today are really not for the lighthearted. There will be mention of forced amputation, SA, torture, mutation of body parts, burning victims, unlawful spreading of diseases. So honestly, please exit out if this sounds like it's going to be a lot and go do a lazy day instead. I love that you watch my videos. It makes me super happy, and I also want to see you thrive in life. I mean, go drink a non-tea substance. I promise we'll do this again some other day. And like I mentioned in the last 2 videos, Japan today is not represented by its past. So please listen with care and no judgment of the country. And let's dive in. Unit 731, as crazy as it sounds, is not widely spoken about in your basic school textbooks. But it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It all started in 1936 when General Ishishiro became the general surgeon for the Imperial Japanese Army, overlooking the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantong Army. At some point, this was an actual department. But like we know now, this department ended up being a front to the real lab, Unit 731. Ishishiro was born in June of 1892 in the Empire of Japan and joined the Imperial Army in 1921, a few months shy from his 30th birthday. From a young age, he was considered a teacher's favorite, being able to recall text from cover to cover after just one read of the book. His classmates, on the other hand, found him to be arrogant and brash, while others claimed he would only shout when irritated, which mainly happened when others couldn't, quote, keep up with his intelligence, unquote. Ishii would go on to enroll into Kyoto Imperial University, studying medicine and graduating in 1920. Then in 1921, when he joined the army as a military surgeon, he would conduct various of research as well as growing bacteria in petri dishes. This led him to catch the eye of the Imperial higher class divisions, who sent him on a 2-year tour of the West. She would spend these 2 years studying the biological and chemical impact on the environment in hopes to create weapons of the same manner. His undying devotion to the emperor helped him gain access to people who would fund his intrinsic researches to help, quote, protect the country's interests. Now this matters a lot because by 1936, Ishii was promoted to senior armory surgeon, overtaking the almost abandoned Unit 731, which in hindsight is crazy if you even think about it, because Ishii is the real reason why this lab even began. And while seeking out for the best scientists in the country to join him, he began researching various of methods to create biological weapons. This led him to come across multiple scientists who were just like-minded as him, and thus began their multiple phases of these studies. Phase 1 was hypothermia. Scientists at this lab wanted to understand how much of the cold could someone truly handle. Do you remember the movie Titanic? I mean, if you haven't seen it yet, there's a scene where Jack is clutching onto Rose's hand, insisting that she lies on the wooden door while his body is drifting into the cold, dark ocean. And the biggest debate for a whole decade was, there was enough room on the door for Jack to get on. I mean, yes, if Rose had given him a little space, yeah, for sure. But by spending 15 minutes in a 32-degree temperature water, Jack ended up passing away. Rose, on the other hand, was a little more lucky. The 2 of them, or actual Titanic victims, were unfortunately exposed to hypothermia, where their bodies were basically frozen solid, shutting down every vital organ and their blood flow circulation. And that's exactly what these scientists were looking to achieve. So these scientists would take their test subject, a prisoner of the war, and stick them outside in the freezing winter with little to almost no clothes on. And if the subject was taking too long to develop a frostbite, they would order soldiers to throw water on them until they were practically frozen. While some subjects were being tortured outside, others were being tortured inside. Scientists would start by submerging their victims into a tub of water filled with ice and hold them down until a visible coating of ice had formed on the skin. For extra measures, soldiers would be required to hit the subject's limb with a wooden stick until they heard the familiar sound of wood clacking. The next step of their theory of a frostbite would be to basically defrost their victims. Some victims would be placed back into a cell overnight to thaw, while others would be met by night duty soldiers who would dump water of 100 to 122 degrees on the victims repeatedly. Scientists would go as far as amputating a frozen limb on the victim's body, reattaching it to the warmer side of the victim to see if blood flow would make it thaw any faster. The next phase would be vivisection, which is a practice of performing operation on living beings for the purpose of scientific research. Victims as young as toddlers to elderly would all be treated the same. Some of these victims would be injected with diseases such as chloria, tuberculosis, and the bubonic plague, while some subjects were sent back to their cells for the diseases to emerge. Others would be operated on immediately. The victims would be tied down to the table, awake and fully aware, be dissected, removing all vital organs for examination. The scientists would study the diseases without decomposition of the human body affecting it. They would do the same to the remaining subject, who evidently start showing signs of purple spots blotching on their skins after a few days. The third phase would be the study of pathogens affecting the human nervous system. Pathogens, which are bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites, would be exposed to their victims in form of gases along with chloria and anthrax. But scientists were worried that the pathogens would spread inside the Unit 731 base itself, so they would use their airfields to deploy the gases in smaller neighboring provinces to see how quickly these could cause an outbreak. Some of these gases were also deployed in balloons countries outside of their bases, including to the US, with almost 200 balloons exploding. The larger effect that they were expecting luckily did not happen, but 7 people did end up dying from exposure. At one point, the Japanese were planning to drop plague-infected fleas using kamikaze pilots, but I was unable to confirm if they panned outside of the Chinese bases. However, they did manage to unleash a lot of these fleas on smaller Chinese towns, and unfortunately did end up killing hundreds and hundreds of people. I mean, into thousands, but the fourth phase would run hand in hand during the making of the biological weapons by testing out all types of weapons. Prisoners would be tied up to stakes and get shot at as practice targets. Some soldiers would practice throwing grenades from certain distances to see how much of an effect the distance could cause the damage. Others would be stabbed with bayonets and other sharp objects, including knives being thrown at them as the soldiers intended to practice their aims. The victims would be analyzed afterwards so that the scientists could understand how much of a damage could be caused with what type of weapon, including how much time it would take that damage to kill their victims. But if being shot or stabbed, exploded, was not enough, some victims were subject to being burned. Soldiers would use flamethrowers on their victims as well as exploding gas fireworks directly at the subjects. The fifth phase was pressure chambers. And because of this particular study, you will never see me keep a laundry or dryer inside of my house. It'll be in the locked garage because victims would be placed into the pressure chambers, spun around aggressively to see how much of a gravity a person can hold before they finally popped their body parts off. Some of these parts would be stored in jars for scientists to come back to later and examine. The final few phases were just a game for these sadistic scientists. They would infect male subjects with syphilis, a form of STI that can cause serious damage if it's left untreated. This included rapid decline of heart, brain, muscles, bones, and eyes. The subject would be ordered to R-word other female and male victims, giving the scientists an opportunity to monitor the onset of diseases being spread. And since the STI didn't work in effect immediately, the scientists would force more and more victims to R-word everyone held captive until they achieved the results that they were seeking. And of course, if the victims refused to infect or even indulge in the scientists' depraved mindset, they would be shot at immediately. Children and elderly were treated no different from these cruel acts. Scientists would once again vivisect their victims to see how quickly syphilis could deteriorate their victims' brains and hearts. Female prisoners were forcibly impregnated and subject to the same studies, only to see how much more of a difference their bodies could hold while carrying. For further understanding the severity of the damage inflicted on the mother, they would cut out the unborn fetus to study the effects of the disease. The unborn fetus would be compared to a born child to determine which damage was greater in the aftermath. None of the children born in this camp survived, whether it was because of the diseases or the scientists decided, you know what, let's also infect these children with diseases afterwards. Other victims would be exposed to radiation, injected with blood from animals, injected with seawater, or even be burnt alive. Between the estimated number of 3,000 to 10,000 victims in the unit itself, none survived. The history of Unit 731 at first was only testimonies of the captured scientists and soldiers. Eventually, hundreds and hundreds of written documentations from the scientists would be discovered. Other than General Ishishiro, notable names discovered on these documents were Dr. Hisato Yoshimura, who led the hypothermia study, Dr. Hideo Futaki, who led the vivisection study, General Masai Kitano, Imatani Shojo, and Lieutenant Shunichi Suzuki. Ishishiro's end goal, of course, was Operation Cherry Blossom at Night, an operation for a plug to be released on the night of September 22nd, 1945. But luckily, August 15, 1945, Japan was forced to surrender to the Allies. Thus led Ishii and the Japanese government to cover up the facilities and experiment, but failed when their secret labs in Tokyo and their main lab in Harbin was discovered. Justice, on the other hand, failed. While the men responsible got away with little to minimum punishment, others were only sent to prison for at least 7 years, being the longest. Ishishiro would end up returning to Japan and opening a medical clinic in Tokyo. He was well liked in his neighborhood and provided free medical care to patients that couldn't afford it. Meanwhile, Hisato Yoshimura would escape from Manchuria, receive war crime immunity, then return to the university and become the president of Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine. Hideo Futaki would end up becoming the president of SJ Company, one of Japan's largest trading company. Masaji Kitano would create a vaccine-producing company that would eventually go bankrupt and finally become the chief of Tokyo location Japan Blood Bank. Matani Shojo would end up receiving the Ashi Prize for his so-called outstanding scientific performance. Shunichi Suzuki, and this one really irked me, would end up becoming the governor of Tokyo. But fine, we can't control justice. What we can do, though, is to keep talking about these events. Hold the men accountable. Currently, Harbin holds one of the largest museums showcasing the atrocities that were committed, known as the Japanese Army's Unit 731 War Crimes Exhibition Hall. And the fraction that I covered in today is barely compared to the actuality of what more happened to these innocent prisoners of war. I'm horrified that these important pieces of our history are well hidden from our view, despite living in the age of technology. But in the same breath, I am so grateful to learn and to teach just the same. My heart aches for the victims who were nothing but a pawn of these sadistic war tactical games, and I truly hope their families receive acknowledgement or apologizes from the government. But more importantly, I hope their ancestors are living in peace. Thank you for listening. Please take care of yourself, and I will see you again soon. Bye.